Hey, hey, hey. It's Filter Free Friday, y'all. Listen, I am so glad y'all here. I got an opportunity Sunday to listen to a sermon specifically about just being a little better on social media. And I took notes, okay? Um, and some of the notes were whenever you post something to think about what's your end game, what's your goal, and what's the purpose and aim of your message. And then the second thing was to think about, have you earned the right to comment on the topic? Um, have you researched and thought about what other people think about what you're talking about? And are you specifically walking the walk? And then third, to consider how you want to show up. Do you want to use social media as a tool or a weapon? So, given that, I just want to be super, super clear that I want to use social media as a tool and not as a weapon. So, that's the frame through which I'm going to try to talk about what has happened this week. So, I started Monday as a celebration of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And one of the reasons why I always add Reverend is because, interestingly enough, I have run into my fair share of people who are absolutely disgusted when they find out I'm a Christian. And I wrote about this briefly in the Holy Educated MFer. I went to a retreat one time and they asked us to stand up. It was like 500 people in the audience. They said, stand up if you are religious. And I stood up. And there were like three other people standing up with me. So, less than 1% of the people in the room would identify as religious. And what was interesting was these were people who had a practice of every day meditating. We spent an entire day in silence to reflect and think about, our lives and how we wanted to show up. These were people who engaged in the type of chanting that I would absolutely call prayer. Now, we had a lot of different faith traditions in the room. So, but nonetheless, it was prayer. But later in the day, we ended up in like a simulation where you had to think about who you were most biased against, that you felt justified in being biased against them, and demonstrate how you believe those people behave. And so there were one or two people who were actively biased against Christians, and they had signs that said, God hates the F word, and they were like yelling and screaming and like bullhorns, like an evangelist on the corner. And in general, they were saying like misogynistic things like the man is the head of the house, which means that the woman doesn't, have any thoughts. And I was like, it's very, very interesting that when they heard the word religious, that's what they thought of. And what I know today is that there are lots of people who distinctly separate religious from spiritual. And I get that. I understand that. And yet, religious is actually doing the acts, like having the rituals that you're going to perform the rituals. And I have rituals, right? Um, I pray every day. I go to church. Um, those rituals, I believe that the things that Jesus had to say in the Bible are helpful to my life. In fact, I spent an entire 2 years reading only the red parts to help me like reconnect with my faith. Now, why do I tell you that? Because when we attack Christianity, especially when we're thinking about the Black experience, there's hardly a way that people would have made it through the trauma um, that was experienced during this country's history of racial terror without religion. Um, and so I always say the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but I had a fantastic opportunity Monday to be with some young people, and the format was beautiful. They would ask questions of the presenters, and then we would respond. So there was DC Okanta from the Johnson County Health Department. There was Jean Peters Baker. There was myself. There was Felicia Saphir, and I think that's it. I don't think I missed anybody. But if I have one talent at all, baby, it's Q&A. You ask me a question and I get a chance to answer. But there were all these things that I wanted to share with the children about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King that I needed time to be able to say. And what if their questions didn't have anything to do with it? So the first question I got was actually related to the introduction that Jim Nunley had given. And the question was, why did you choose to go to an HBCU? Beautifully aligned to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because he went to Morehouse College, which was also an HBCU. And at the time, he wouldn't have been able to go to any other university. It was prohibited by law. And the best part of the day was when the children learned. There were 80-year-olds in the room, several of them, like 5 at least. And I mentioned that octogenarians or 80-year-olds would have been 24 at least, if not 25, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And there was an audible gasp. They were like, and it occurred to me that this narrative that we keep pushing, that we need to leave things in the past because it's so long ago, is actually effective and is actually working. Um, and I was so grateful I was there. I'm trying to figure out how I can engage those children on my youth area task force, because I'm a human rights commissioner for the city of Kansas City, if you didn't know that. I'm actually quite proud of that role. I'm just trying to figure out how I can galvanize it and make it more impactful, but that's an aside. Back to these children. So the children in the state of Florida, interestingly enough, this exact same week, have had Ron DeSantis um, prohibit the teaching of African American history. And I think that's very interesting, because my question is, what is going on with us here in the United States that we think certain things should not be studied? We don't think violence should be studied, which I think is interesting. The week of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday being honored, we have completely turned that birthday into a service celebration at the urging of President Barack Obama. I think it is a wonderful thing to do service. And I also think it's fascinating that people have said that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life was all about service, when everything I read about him, I didn't really see any charitable acts necessarily. I'm sure he did them because he was a pastor of a church. But all the stuff you read about him, he was an activist, a social justice activist. So how did we get to this service place? I'm not so sure. And service by nature is doing work for which you do not get paid. And at the time of his assassination, which was the second attempt on his life, one was a failed attempt, this one was successful. He was actually fighting for the Poor People's Campaign, um, the sanitation workers in Memphis, trying to get them to stop working for low and no wages. So I just think that's interesting. Nonetheless, if we don't believe things should be studied, we're not even curious about it. What it says to me is that we're afraid of what it would uncover. Because in less than 2 weeks, we are going to be in Black History Month. And you cannot tell the history of Black people in this country without telling the horrible nature of what white US citizens are capable of. And I fundamentally believe that it's not that you don't want to learn about Black history so much, DeSantis, but it is that you don't want children to learn about the history of racial terror perpetuated by white people. And for the last like 5 weeks or so, I haven't really even touched on race. And I haven't lost any friends. And you wonder, like, Nicole, how do you even know that? How do you keep track of that? I don't. but I'm usually at my friend max. And whenever I talk about race, people will unfriend me. And so then I can start getting friend requests again. That's how I know. So for the past few weeks or so, I've been talking more about empathy and less about race, and so I haven't lost any followers. And I need to make space for Mama Hakima. So I figured I'd actually tackle this race thing because it has everything in the world to do with empathy. And so when I think about what's my social media goal, do I want to use it as a tool or as a weapon? I think I have a unique God given ability to help people think about terms and concepts in ways that they haven't before. And y- you can't do that and be in a Black body without sometimes making people upset. That's not my intention. That's just mm, a side effect, let's call it that. And yesterday, I was in an audience with about 200 people where someone was genuinely shocked by where we are today. Not wanting to support social emotional learning for children, anti CRT, which means two things. One is culturally responsive teaching, teaching in a way that you bring in the learnings of the students, their life experiences, so that they can understand what you're talking about. So here's an example of what I did Monday. I really don't know that much about hip hop. I've actually written about that in a few posts, but I knew the young people I was talking to likely would be. So I asked them, how old was Little Uzi Vert? How old was Cardi B? How old is Drake? And then I contrasted the ages of those hip hop artists today with the age of Martin Luther King Jr., basically stating that, he was 26 years old when they did the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, that he was 35 years old when 34 maybe, when he gave the I Have a Dream speech. Like, the man lived for almost 33, maybe. He lived for almost 6 additional years after giving that speech, and was granted the Nobel Peace Prize because we got voting rights legislation passed because of him. Um, ep- when you decide that you going wherever you sitting right now, and if you happen to be in a coffee shop, you have to ask yourself, would you have been able to go there if it were not for the legislation pushed by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all the people who were supporting him? You know, um, wherever you live, would you have been able to live there? I know here in my town, I often heard of stories that Black people could not live past 39th Street, and then pretty much didn't go past the 20s, really. And so the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. actually changed legislation to change your life. Now, you can 50-ish years later look at it and go, well, he should have done this and he shouldn't have done that. He should have done this and he shouldn't have done that. But it's problematic to me to wear a shirt to say I'm more Malcolm than Martin, because we need both. We need people who will shake the gates from the outside and call a spade in the most, take a global look at issues of inequity, willing to work across faiths, willing to look inward into communities and say, we need to do, these are the things we need to do, forget what they're doing. But we also need people who are willing to change legislation. And had that legislation not been changed, you likely would not be wherever you are in the world in this moment. And so I think it's fascinating when I can contrast the ages between the people that these young people know today with how old the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was. Because what I wanted them to know was that his assassination was sanctioned by the state. The government wanted him to be dead. We took away his ability to grow old. He didn't give his life for civil rights. It was taken. It was taken. And so when you consider that we don't want to teach this, it is astonishing to me that we are surprised by this. You may be disappointed, but surprised? I really want to know, what did we think was going to happen? Racism sells. it gets people elected. We had 17 Republican options that we could have chosen for president of the United States after President Barack Obama. And we chose the one that many of us would never allow to lead any of our organizations, our churches, our schools, because we believe the things that he said out of his mouth were detrimental and harmful. And we have cultures that we say are inclusive and equitable, and that the values of these cultures are ones of teamwork and collaboration and belonging and respectfulness. How do you think that the person at the highest level of leadership for our country could be everything but those things? And you say, let me vote for him anyway, and then not understand that this is where we're going to end up. I don't know. But here's my hope. My hope would be that we would start to expect the behavior of the Ron DeSantis of the world. And in that expectation, would just say to ourselves, okay, so if he's going to ban African American history, then that means we really need to be vigilant about putting African American history in U.S. history where it belongs, sharing the history of racial terror in this country and the savagery that is the way that we can show up when we don't have legislation to protect people. Look at when you don't have legislation to protect people, what is okay. And you don't have to think about it from a race perspective. Think about it from a domestic violence perspective. What was acceptable? Like, it was printed in magazines that, you might need to spank your wife, if she talks out of hand. We had 867 strangulation cases in 2021 in Jackson County. 867. And you darn well better believe it would be more than that if it were not illegal. We need institutional laws. And what does that have to do with empathy and what my ultimate goal is? These laws don't make themselves. There are people who do not have the ability to lean in and look at the experiences of other people and say, oh my God, I understand. And I wouldn't want that to happen if it were me. I fully believe, though, that we can spark an empathy revolution in this country. And I believe my beautiful city, right here in the heart of the nation, is going to be right at the helm of it. If you want to join me, visit drnicoleprice.com. And I think there's a way for you to let me know what you think if you disagree with any and all of this. It's Filter Free Friday, y'all. We got plenty work to do.